areas, engineering applications, this has revolutionized the use of artificial intelligence. There are two reasons for doing this. First reason is that because of the nonlinearity present in neural network architecture and the depth present in deep learning architectures, this can approximate very complex functions. If you from yesterday's talks, you can think of a machine learning algorithm as you have some input X and you predict some output Y. So the machine learning algorithm is kind of a function fx such that y is fx plus some residual, which is the uncertainty in the model. So this fx should be called a machine learning model. So what the deep learning architectures do is that they help you realize very complex functions. That's one of the reasons of its success. Your input is an image, a high dimensional image, and output is a face. It's a very complicated mapping. It realizes this. The second reason it is successful is that this kind of is a step towards automated AI. So earlier, any data analysis or machine learning tasks you do, it has to be preceded by something called a feature engineering step, where what you do, you come up with a representation of a problem. You come up with a feature vector or an input vector which represents a problem. For example, if you want to represent, let's say, whether a person would be returning a credit card loan, you find out using experts a set of attributes of a person, which will help the system to determine whether he or she will return the loan. Okay, so these are in machine learning terminology called handcrafted features. Handcrafted features. Okay, so there would be some expert which would be deciding on a representation, a set of features to represent an object.
Professor Pavitra, I think your slides are not moving. It's still on the deep learning slide.
Introduction?
Yes.
Okay, maybe I'll stop sharing and I'll share again. Am I moving to a perceptron slide?
Yes, yes. Now it's on the perceptron.
Okay, so what deep learning helps us do is that if you have a data which is complex, you really don't have domain experts to decide what is a good representation of the data. The deep learning can help you automatically find such a representation. Sometimes that's why it's also called a representation learning. It helps you find out a representation of the data, a set of features to describe it. This is even more important when you have unstructured data like image or text or music or sound, things like that. Okay, so there are too many dimensions. There is no particular structure in the data. It's a kind of very complex. There is no particular structure. In such cases, the deep learning architecture would help you discover the representations, and then finally using those representation come up with the data. So this was the motivation. So let us quickly now move to the definition and what is a deep learning system and how do you train it. So it all started with a notion of a computing element known as perceptron, very early, maybe around 1960s. So when computer science was just developing, digital computer was just developing, people came up with an idea that you can do computation using a simple computing element, just like you have logic gates, you have AND gate and OR gate to do your digital operations. You can have a simple kind of gate. I'm not really calling it a gate, but a computing element which will do some. And what this computing element does, it has a vector of input x1 to xm, and it has one output y, and something in between to convert this x1 to y. The reason it was called perceptron is that people felt at that time in biology there was a discovery that how a nervous system of a mammal or any other organism, it looks like it consists of basic neurons, and this architecture was a crude approximation of the neuron. So what does it do? Let us quickly see. It takes the input and multiplies each input by an weight W1, W2 up to Wn. So it has a vector of weights W1 to Wn and does a term by term multiplication of xi with wi, and then adds up all these terms. It sums up all these terms. Sorry. It sums up all these terms. And then adds something called a bias to it. And after all this, so B plus sigma W1 x1, W2 x2, Wn xn gives you something called an induced field or V. On this induced field, you transform the induced field by a nonlinear function known as the activation function. Let's denote this by phi. So it's basically phi of this V to get the final output. So this is a simple perceptor. There are many ways of interpreting this. One of the way of interpreting this is that see what is W1 x1 W plus W2 x2 plus Wm xm plus b. It's nothing but equation of a plane, a linear plane in m dimension. So the induced field, basically you can look at the sign of the positive or negative of the induced field and decide which side of the line the vector x1 to xm lies. And of course, you can have a function which kind of looking at this or kind of maps instead of this positive and negative values to a 0, 1 value, like that's like digital logic, converts it to a 0, 1 value. So this is the geometric interpretation. There can be other interpretations as well. This is a linear function, and such interpretations are possible. Now you can have different types of activation function. For example, you can have a step function, which is a two-level function. So the step function takes on a value A, usually 1, or B, usually 0, depending on whether the activation V, not the activation, the induced field B is greater than or less than some threshold C. So it's like a step function, which I think all of you are familiar. Then there's a ramp function, which is kind of a straight line. It's beyond beyond a value of V greater than C or less than C, it takes a value A, let's say 0. I think last time I made a mistake. A would be 0 and B would be 1, usually. A would be 0, and then beyond certain value D, B would be 1. And in between this 0 and 1, you have a straight line connecting them. Okay, this is a ramp function. You can have you can have other type of functions also. For example, there can be something called a rectified linear unit. It's like a diode. So up to 0, its value is 0. From 0 onwards, it's a straight line passing through the origin. Then you can have a sigmoid function, which is like a S-shaped function. We'll discuss this in more detail. And then you can have a Gaussian function, which is a bell-shaped function. So any of this you can use as a activation function. But usually we will look for a property that as the input of the function goes to very large values, it saturates to 1, and as it goes to very small value, maybe negative value, very small negative values, it saturates to 0. And in between there is a variation from 0 to 1. It can be a step variation, it can be a straight line variation like a ramp, or it can be a slow variation like a S function or a sigmoid. Let us look at the sigmoid function in a little more detail. So the activation function for a sigmoid takes this form. Fx is 1 by 1 plus e to the power minus x. This is the typical S-shaped function. So this is a very popular choice that has been used. Of course, there are variations to this. This is also, those who have attended yesterday's class, this is also known as a logistic function. Logistic function. It's not necessarily to get this shape using 1 by 1 plus e to the power minus x. You can also use tan hyperbolic. You can also use other functions which gives you this shape. And one good thing about the sigmoid function is that if you take the derivative of fx with respect to dx, you get fx times 1 minus fx. So that's a very nice property which simplifies some of the downstream calculations. Okay, so how do you use this perceptron? As we have discussed in yesterday's class, you want to realize from some input to output mapping, unknown input to output mapping, and you have a training set which is a supervised training set where a set of x1 to xn vectors, this would be m, x1 to xn vectors, and corresponding output y values are given. And you have to find out the parameters of the perceptron. What are the parameters of the perceptron? Parameters of the perceptron are W1 to Wn and the bias. By the way, there is a small trick which gives a slightly different way at looking at the bias. Instead of calling it B, let's say I call it another weight W0. And let's say the input to that weight W0 is always set to 1, X0. So you have an input X0 which is by default 1, always 1. So this entire thing is summation W0 X0 plus W1 X1 plus W2 X2 up to Wn, etc. So what? So now you see. So the parameters are this W0 to Wn. Now, what is the? I already said that this is kind of a linear hyperplane in m dimension. So this hyperplane would naturally change if you change the values of the parameters W0 to Wn. It will change. But in my training set, there is a particular hyperplane we are desiring, in the sense that there is a particular hyperplane which will match the training set input outputs, which will give this x vector and the corresponding y vector and the x vector corresponding y vector. All those we have had in the training set. We'll try to match up with them. We'll try to the output that this perceptron provides should be very close to the y value that is desired. For that, we'd like to get that perceptron. How do you get that perceptron? The way to get that perceptron is to find out a set of values of W1 to Wn, W0 to Wn, which will give me those desired values. But this I don't know. So what I do, I get these values by an optimization process. So I can define the optimization problem as find out the set of parameter values such that in the training set, the error in the training set, error defined by the desired output minus the actual output, let's say square of that and summed over all the training points, that should be minimum. So it's an optimization problem. This optimization problem is often solved by something called a gradient descent. So what I do in gradient descent is that we start with initial random guess of W0 to Wn, then look at the error, the sum squared error for that initial guess, and then take try to part out, try to change, try to update the W0 to W1 the parameters, so that you take a step towards the steepest gradient. So now you can realize one thing, that as I have also discussed in the yesterday's talk, if you keep on changing values here W0 to Wn, your error values will change, and if you plot that, you will get something called an error surface. So now any point in the error surface is a combination of W0 to Wn. You take the slope of the error surface, you update your guess of W0 to Wn by taking a new point which is towards the direction of the steepest slope starting from the initial guess. So this process is known as the gradient descent. You are going down you are descending on the error surface in a direction of the steepest gradient. It's an easy way to visualize this. It's like, say, suppose you are in the Himalayas, you are somewhere in the Himalayas. You can imagine as an undulating surface with different altitudes at different points, and you really don't have a map of where, and you want to go down to the lowest point, let's say, the smallest altitude point, and you really don't have a map, so you don't know what to go or which way to take. But what you have instead is that you can look around and find out in which direction the downward slope is the highest. So you look at 360-degree direction, you find out the direction that the downward slope is highest. You take a step in that direction. You go a little bit down, and then again look around, and again find what is the steepest descent direction. Take another step in direction. Now, how big you will take a step, that can be controlled by something called a learning rate. If your learning rate is small, you take a small step. If your learning rate is big, you take a larger step. If the surface, the undulating surface, is well behaved in the sense that there is only global minima and no local minima, this process will always take you to the lowest point, the minimum. But if there are local minimas, there are intermediate local points, there is a possibility that you get stuck there. You look around and you find that there is no direction in which there is a descent, everywhere it's going up. So you kind of fool into thinking that this is the lowest point, but that is not the lowest point. If you had overcome that local minima, maybe you would find another lower minima. Similarly, if you have a plateau where the gradient is 0 all around, you really can't decide which is the direction of the steepest descent. So this is in a nutshell what is the gradient descent algorithm. So you can easily find out the parameters of this perceptron, single perceptron, using this gradient descent algorithm. You can find out the values of W0 to Wn by where your error is some loss, some function, we sometimes call it error function or a loss function, between the actual output Y in the training set and the predicted output O for every point in the training set. Okay, so you can actually get this. This was very popular. People used it in all sorts of problems. People used it in image recognition and other things. Then sometimes people find out that this has limitations, in the sense that this is a hyperplane, a linear surface. So when you have a function which is kind of a binary function, a 0-1 function, so that in one side of the hyperplane it's 1 and in the other side it's 0, it's fine. But you have many complicated functions which cannot be realized by a single hyperplane like this. You need multiple hyperplanes. You need a piecewise linear function to approximate the complicated nonlinear boundary between the 0 points and the 1 points. So then naturally what we do if we want such kind of piecewise linear function, just like you do in logic circuits. In logic circuits what you do, you take your AND gate and OR gate, and if you have to realize a more complicated logic function, you connect them up. You connect up the gates. You use a sum of product or product of sum. First you use some AND gates, then their output you feed into an OR gate. So you have a 2-level circuit and so on. So you connect up your basic elements and construct a circuit. So the same thing was done here. These perceptrons are connected up to form some kind of 2-level circuit or more level circuits which equivalently is a nonlinear function consisting of multiple hyperplanes, linear hyperplanes connected. Okay, and if you connect them up in this way, then people showed that you can, by using this kind of piecewise linear approximation of a nonlinear function, you can actually realize any complicated nonlinear function. Just like using only AND gate and OR gate, they are universally, you can realize any digital logic. Here also, just using these perceptrons as the basic units and connecting them up in the form of a circuit, you can realize arbitrarily complicated functions. You can realize any complicated function by using sufficiently large number of these individual perceptrons and connecting them up in a proper way. Okay, so just as in digital circuits, there is a particular way you connect up the gates, sometimes known as canonical forms, like sum of product or product of sum. Here also, you connect them up in a particular way. And the way you connect them, the scheme by which you connect them up, is called the architecture. Okay, so this perceptron is sometimes called a single neuron. And if you connect them up, they are called a neural network. It's a network of neurons. Any biological system which have a nervous system, a central nervous system, will have such a neural network. So now you get different families of neural network depending on what is the scheme you use to connect them up. What is the network topology? And you can think of this as some kind of canonical form or something like that. Okay, so the way you connect up these neurons are called neural network architectures. Neural network architectures, and you have families of architectures. One of the first architecture, and still the most popular architecture perhaps, is called a multi-layered perceptron. A multi-layered perceptron. So this looks like this. In fact, I put another adjective to it. It's not just multi-layer perceptron, it's multi-layer feed-forward neural network. So how it is done? So what happens is that each of these individual perceptrons, they are arranged in layers. So all these blue boxes are the so-called input layer, and all these green circles are so-called the output layer, and these brown circles, they are the perceptrons or neurons belonging to the hidden layer. Okay, and this is a layered architecture. And one thing you see that all the neurons in one layer, output of all the neurons in one layer are connected as input to all the neurons in the next layer. See, output of this is connected to this, and this, all these four. Output of the second blue box is connected to all the four brown circles in the next layer. So this brown layer is sometimes called the hidden layer, as I said. So these are all connected. Okay, but you see there is no backward connection. This brown output of these brown circles are not connected to these blue circles. Similarly, the output of these green circles are not connected to the brown circles. It's feed forward, and also it is a one layer feed forward. That means this blue connects to the brown, brown connects to the green, but blue doesn't connect to the green. One more property is that these are fully connected networks. That means every blue output of every blue box is connected as input of all the brown boxes. Similarly, output of every brown circle is connected as input to all the green circles. So this is a fully connected, feed-forward, multi-layered network. Okay, and the first layer is called input, the last layer is called output. Everything in between are called hidden layers. This is an example of a single layer hidden layer. I'll write it this way. I'll write it as a 3-4-2 network, which means 3 nodes in input, 4 nodes in hidden, and 2 nodes in output. Okay, so a perceptron has a single output, but here I can put as many output as I want. Similarly, depending on the dimension of the input vector, so many input neurons I'll put. So depending on your problem, the number of nodes in the input and output layer are fixed. You are free to play with the number of hidden layers or number of nodes in the hidden layer. Usually, there are two types of network. One is called a fat network, in which the number of hidden layers are not much, but you have large number of nodes in a hidden layer. It's called a fat neural network. The alternate is there are not many number of nodes in a particular hidden layer, single hidden layer, but there are many hidden layers. This is called a tall network. Okay, sometimes so it's a wide network versus a tall network. These tall networks are sometimes called deep networks. Although deep networks can have, see, this is relative. It's the relative value between the width of a network, width of a layer to number of layers. Okay. So the ones which you have large number of layers would be called a deep multi-layer perceptron. This entire thing is this entire family of architecture is called a multi-layered perceptron or a MLP for short. This has the property that it's a layered architecture, it's a feed-forward architecture, it's a fully connected architecture. Okay, so this architecture, usually I'll denote it by this terminology, I'll call it as a 3-4-2 network. All right. So people found out that if you look at this architecture, you can actually easily visualize. So if you look at one of these brown circles, it is a single perceptron or a neuron. So one brown circle represents one linear hyperplane, and the second brown circle represents another linear hyperplane, and so on. So you see the output of this brown circle sort of determines an input point which side of the first hyperplane it is. The second one decides which side of the second hyperplane it is. The third one which side of the third hyperplane it is. And if you use different permutation and combinations of this, so the origin side of the first hyperplane, the non-origin side of the second hyperplane, again the origin side of the third hyperplane. The hyperplane has two sides, origin and non-origin. Side in which the origin of the coordinate lies and the non-origin. This is high school coordinate geometry. Often we represent the non-origin side as the positive side, because if you take a point and if you plug in the values to the equation of the hyperplane, sigma wi xi will be, it would be a positive value, and in the origin side it would be a negative value. Okay, so I can sort of, given an input point, it can be positive side of first neuron, negative side of third neuron, positive side of fourth neuron, and so on. So you can have different combinations. If you look at the positive side as 1 and negative side as 0, this output can be 1 0 1 0, something like this. Different combinations you can have. Okay, and what this second level output does for a particular combination, it says that okay, for this particular combination of origin and non-origin side of these hyperplanes, my output should be this. And maybe the second one decides that this combination of hyperplane output should be this. Okay, so if you mentally visualize, this is as if you are, by combining this origin non-origin side of these hyperplanes, you are kind of drawing out, you are kind of carving out some region in your input space encircled by a piecewise linear boundary. Piecewise linear boundary, it's encircled. And you know, by piecewise linear, combination of piecewise linear, any arbitrarily complex nonlinear function can be realized. You are doing just that. You are doing just that. Okay, so there is a theorem. Let me see if I have it. Okay, I'll come back to that. there is a theorem called the universal approximation theorem, which says is that whatever complex input-output nonlinear function you want to realize, you can realize it using a multilayer perceptron containing just one hidden layer. You can realize it using that. But there's a catch. The catch is the hidden layer might be very, very wide. It may contain may need to contain many number of neurons. Okay, but it has been shown that if you increase your depth, you can actually realize arbitrarily complex functions using much less number of neurons. In fact, this motivates something called a convolutional neural network, which avoids these fully connected layers by taking into account the problem information. All right, so let's say this is a universal approximation. But now, this is just an architecture, this is just a schema. The exact function from input to output that is realized by this multilayer perceptron will be realized. But by the way, note that each of these circles are individual neurons. So these input connections, they will have weight, W0, W1, W2, Wn. This will also, so usually you have a double index notation. So W11 means the connections between the first and the second layer. So you will have, or rather it's a 3 index notation. So I can say W1 is the first layer, second layer, and W1ij means it connects the ith neuron in the first layer, the jth neuron in the second layer. Similarly, Wkij would mean the kth between k-1 to kth layer, connecting the ith neuron in the k-1th layer to jth neuron in the kth layer. So you need 3 indices to represent a neuron. Okay, but individually, if you cut out one of this circle, it would be a single neuron. All right. So this is just a family. The exact function that is realized will depend on the values of these W's, values of these weights, so to say. It will depend on the value of these weights. So again, the question arises that how do we train the network? Train the network meaning, how do we find the set of weights which will give me minimum error between the input, between the predicted output and the desired output. Okay, so let me give some example. Say this input is an face image. It's all the pixel values of an face image, and the output is I have to predict if this is the face of let's say Virat Kohli. It's the face of Virat Kohli or not. Okay, so the desired output is. So you have 2 possibilities. Let's say if the first green one value is 1 and the second one is 0, it means the face is that of Virat Kohli. And if the second one is 1 and the first one is 0, maybe it's the face of Mahendra Singh Dhoni. You have to decide. You have to correctly classify it's Virat Kohli or Mahendra Singh. All right. So human beings are very easy to do that, easily do that. But let's say what happens. What happens, how do you measure error is that given an input image, now let's say Virat Kohli can have different type of face images. It's not a single, there are billions of images of the face of Virat Kohli all over the internet. So you take any one such image, you predict the output. Let's say your prediction is 1 for the first neuron and 0 for the second neuron. That means your prediction is correct, your error is 0. But if it was the other way around, the first one is 0, second one is 1, your output is wrong because it is actually, you are predicting Mahendra Singh Dhoni, it's actually Virat Kohli. So you get your error is, let's say, 1. Okay, so this way, if you have a training set consisting of, let's say, 1000 images of Mahendra Singh Dhoni and Virat Kohli, if you are correct in 900 out of these 1000 images, your error is 10%. Okay, so what you want is, of course, I mean, sort of say like a slightly incorrect thing. Your actual goal is to not to correctly classify just these 1000 training set points. Your actual goal is in future, if this network is given an input of Virat Kohli, let's say after 30 years, will it still be able to recognize it? Will be able to generalize to unseen inputs? That's the goal, but you really don't know what will happen, what input will get after 30 years. So right now, the best you can do is to minimize the error on these 1000 input images, training images you already have. Okay, so if that is my goal, then there will be a particular collection of W values, of these weight values, which will give me the minimum error possible among all possible weight values. Not that this error may not go to 0. Okay, may not go to 0 because it's not possible to go to 0 maybe. Okay, so but you want the minimum. How do you do that? You use the same procedure of gradient descent that you have used in your single passing time. So same, you form an error surface, and you start with an initial guess of all the weight values called the parameters, the network parameters. Update the weight value. Okay, so let me explain briefly this algorithm. Initialize all the weight values to small random numbers. And then for each training example, what you do, so you input the training example and with the current guess of all the weight values, find out the network output. This step 1 is called the forward propagation step. You give the input, you get the output. It's the forward propagation. Assuming the current values of weight are right, correct. Once you get the output, for each of the output unit, you compute the error represented by delta K. What is the error? Let's say the output is OK for that. So the K is 2 for our example. You have 2 outputs. OK is the output you get, the predicted output you get after the forward propagation. 1 minus OK. If you remember, this is the derivative of the sigmoid. Into Tk. Tk is the target output, the actual output. If it is Virat Kohli's face, the actual target output should have been 1. Target output minus the predicted output you get, Tk minus OK. This entire thing would be called a delta K. This is like a correction, delta K in the output. Now this delta you kind of back propagate. That's why it's called the back propagation algorithm. You know the delta of the output unit. From that, you calculate the delta of the hidden unit. This kind of a mirror image of what we did in forward propagation. You remember forward propagation, I give an input, summation Wixi, get the input to this, again summation Wxi, with the sigmoid I get this, and so on. It's forward propagation. You do the reverse, kind of, you take the delta as input, kind of you reverse all these arrows in the connection weights. Then you get a delta, as if the delta is output of this green circle. Take that as input of this brown circle. So sigma delta W Wixi. You connect all this delta times W, this delta times W, that is the input to it. And this output would be similarly calculated, sigma delta 1x W1 delta 2 W2 plus, and so on. And that would be the delta of this layer. So the output, if you reverse this arrows, and delta you consider to be the input coming on from the other side, this would be the delta for this, and so on. Same recursive rule applies. Okay, so that's what you have done, sigma W. Once you have calculated, so every node after each backpropagation step will have a delta value. Then how do you update the weight? You update Wji. Let's say Wgi is the weight between ith node of any one layer to the jth node of the next layer, is the old value of Wgi plus a delta W. What is delta W? Delta W is some learning rate eta. You remember I told you, you take a big step or a small step. The learning rate eta times the delta for that node times the xji, the forward propagation input I get to that node. Okay, type from the value coming from the ith node to the jth node into the delta of the jth node into the eta. That would be delta Wji. So the Wji would be old value of Wji plus delta Wji. This would be the update rule. You can easily see that this is equivalent to that gradient descent, steepest descent rule I talked about. This is equivalent. You can easily derive just by applying the chain rule of differentiation, nothing else. You just have to apply the chain rule of differentiation. Okay, there are some modifications to this. Ideally, you should calculate delta by combining the error between Tk and Ok for all the input training examples. You accumulate the error, then backpropagate. Okay, you calculate all the error, then backpropagate. That is sometimes costly, so you do a batch learning. That means you don't take all the, there may be many training examples, millions of training examples. You don't wait to add them up. You take batches of, let's say, size 50 or 100 training examples, and for those you add up and calculate delta, and then backward, then take the next batch. Sometimes you do something called a batch normalization. You normalize the delta. And if your batch size is 1, that means for every input you do this, you backpropagate. Every input you forward propagate, then backpropagate. This would bring in some kind of randomness. And is slight difference to this is sometimes called as stochastic gradient descent or SGD, which is slightly defined, but the idea is overall like this. Okay, you can show that that is equivalent to a random number randomly using the weights to update and so on. Okay. So this is in a nutshell. This is in a nutshell the backpropagation rule. You can. I am not going to the full derivation, but there are very nice textbooks, Haykins or any textbook you can take to find out the details of this. From a computation point of view, while you are training, this backpropagation is the step which takes the longest time. It takes a hell of a time. It slows. If you take a very large network, it would take days to complete your backpropagation, unless you use a nice GPU architecture. So in the other later talks today, we will see how we accelerate this. No, because see, originally this neural network was thought of as a massively parallel architecture. It's a distributed processing. Every node is taking their bit of information, processing something, and finally aggregating it. It's massively distributed. The first book of neural network was called the PDP book, Parallel Distributed Processing. It's massively distributed. So this inherent parallelism can be exploited by GPUs. There are other issues as well. For example, I am assuming these weights to be high precision. There will be arbitrary precision values. There can be, say, 2.0035 and so on. So do these floating point operations will take a lot of time. Sometimes in many hardware, these are represented by special data types, which is something in between an integer and a floating point number. And then all these operations become faster. You have specific hardware to do these operations in few clock cycles. Okay, so that would accelerate things even further. So these are some things which modern architectures would do. Okay, all right. So more or less, by the way, one more thing I told that see, this delta is kind of the derivative of the error function with respect to the weight values, the partial derivative of the error function with respect to So one requirement of the error function, if you want to compute the derivative, is that it should be differentiable at all points, for all values of w and all these things. Error function should be differentiable. And in order for the error function to be differentiable, all these, see, summation wixi is differentiable, no problem about that. But you are applying an activation function, so your activation function should be differentiable. In other words, the whole fx from input to output that we talked about should be a differentiable function. Otherwise, you cannot apply the back propagation rule. So whatever architecture you propose, whatever activation function, whatever error function you propose, unless they are differentiable, this back propagation cannot be applied. But if this is differentiable, whatever complicated thing you take, you can easily write a backpropagation update rule for the architecture and for that error function. Okay. In fact, one of the things I have not covered is that sometimes this backpropagation can be written as something called a computation graph. It's basically an see, this is a geometric diagram. This is a topology diagram. You can think of this as a graph, but you can also kind of form a procedural graph in the sense that first this is computed, then this is computed, then this is computed, then in the back propagation delta is computed, then this delta. You can also write this out at the form of a graph. That is known as a computational graph. All the TensorFlow and other neural network learning algorithm, what they do, instead of directly writing down this delta and other thing, they just specify the backpropagation computation graph. It's a data structure, they write down the data structure. If you specify the computation graph, then all this update rule, everything, it automatically finds out from there. It automatically finds out from there. Okay. Again, due to lack of time, I am not covering it, but you are encouraged to go through the computation graph formulation of this, available again in any textbook. Okay, so now, this is kind of the fundamental. Any neural network you take, you would use backpropagation, you use some kind of connection weights, you use some error function. But again, as I told, that you can have different topology, you can have different network parameters, you can have many. By the way, there are again small changes in this backpropagation. Sometimes to avoid local minima, you apply a momentum term, which kind of throws you out of a local minima in the weight update. So it's WGI is WGI plus delta WGI plus delta square WGI or some eta times W. So other terms are also there. Sometimes there is additional terms called well, I need to show the sigmoid term, sigmoid function. Yeah, I don't think I have a diagram. It's like a S function. It's like a S function. I'm coming to that question, how features can be reused. Okay, so there is sometimes an additional term called a regularization parameter. See, everything, any change you make in the training rule is in this update. WGI is WGI plus delta WGI. Everything is in this update. So how do you define your delta WGI? Either you define this as eta times delta JXGI, or you can have additional terms. For example, sometimes there is a regularization term which penalizes high values of W, very large values of W it penalizes. Sometimes there is something called a L2 regularization, which W square, it doesn't allow you to get very large values of W square. So there are many other terms you can add to this delta W. Okay, so these are the design choices that you can have. You can choose your data representation, you can choose your network architecture, you can choose your network parameters, you can choose your training procedure, you use momentum term or don't use. And finally, there's an important thing called a validation. When do you stop your training? When do you know the neural network is converged? The way to do this is that there is a separate set of training data besides the training data set, which you call the validation set. So in your backpropagation, you use your training data set, but you look at the accuracy or the error on a separate unknown set. Yeah, I'm answering. How do you determine the number of nodes? On a separate set, you calculate the error. This set is called a validation set. It's a very nice analogy there. Suppose you are giving a competitive example. So you practice on a set of problems. Those will be called a training set. You practice, you try to minimize your error on that. And then you give a mock exam. And mock exam is kind of the validation step. Depending on your score in the mock exam, you decide, do you need to train more, do you need to study more, or you are happy. This is the validation set. And then you have your final exam, after which, so by the time you go to the final exam, you don't have any more opportunity to train again. Whatever you get in your final exam, that is the unseen example. That is the actual deployment. Where, say say you are recognizing Virat Kohli and Mahendra, it's actually deployed in a TV system or something, television or something. Okay, so that's the final. You don't have any more opportunity to retrain after that, but you have opportunity to retrain on a validation set. Okay, so that's the final exam. That's the generalization. That's the unseen exam. Exams are unseen. So these are the things that you can decide. These are the design choices. Network topology includes whether it's feed-forward, feedback, how many nodes you have. Is it 2, 3, 4, 2, 4, 3, or 2, 4, 4, 3, or 2, 10, 3? What type of network you take? This is somewhat of an open problem besides some choices. By the way, this is what I mentioned. This is called the expressiveness of a neural network. How complex a function you can approximate using, let's say, this 2, 4, 3 or whatever architecture you have decided upon. So these are some results. But there is a trade-off. The more complex, more number of layers you take, the larger number of network you take, your training set, you will approximate better and better and better. So in the x-axis, model complexity, I mean the network size. Okay, network size. Say 10 layer or 100 layer or 4 neuron per layer, something like that. So as you go on increasing that, your training error will keep on decreasing. You will fit it better and better and better and better. You might remember, all of you have done the Ohm's law experiment in physics. So you, in the x-axis you plot voltage, y-axis you plot current. If you honestly take the observations, they will never fall in a line. They will be slightly this side, that side of the line. And if you are asked to fit a function between mapping V to I, if you want to exactly match those data points, you will form a very complicated zigzag, 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 something joining all the points, you draw a curve. Okay, so more complex a curve you take, more accurately you can fix the training error. But that complicated curve on a new piece of resistance or something will not give the correct result. The straight line, which is much simpler, which has low model complexity, but it gives some error on the training set examples observations that you have, that is more preferred. Okay, so as complexity, as you increase model complexity, your training error will go down and down and down, but the validation error or the testing error, so to say, on unseen examples, after a certain point of time, it will start increasing. So this region where you have not yet minimized the error is called the underfitting region. And where your training set goes down, but test set error goes up, it's called the overfitting region. This valley in between the underfitting and the overfitting region is the correct place where you should stop your training, or you should choose an architecture, choose a model complexity. The best complexity is when you come at this inflection point. Where, in other words, where you get the minimum test set error. Yes, why the error increases suddenly? Yes, that's a very good question. That's an excellent question. See, the thing is that what does it mean? Let's say, what does it mean as so here is I have added a one hidden layer with one neuron, then say 2 neuron, 3 neuron, 4 neuron, 5 neuron, 100 neuron. Your training error will go on, but the test set what will have? Because let's say your actual function should have been actually realized by, let's say, 5 neurons. Let's say, nobody knows actually what is the thing, but let's say 5 neurons. It's so complicated, nobody really has the answer to that, but let's say hypothetically it is 5 neurons. So what will happen when you keep up to 5 neurons in a network, your test set error will come down. But after that, noise and the other individual things, it will so accurately try to fit into that. On new examples, it will start making error. This is a typical rote learning that this domain, this overfitting is sometimes called rote learning. See, it's like you are practicing some problems in your practice session and you have sort of memorized all the problems, answers, you have memorized. And then on unseen examples, if you just try to repeat table lookup, what this memorization is, you will make error. You will make error. So this basically says that after some point, rote learning fails. You have to generalize. You have to see, rote learning requires more memory. You have to remember each and every practice example. Whereas generalization or model learning, you understand the fundamental principles, the fundamental Newton's law. If in rote learning, for every velocity, we will calculate the acceleration, momentum. You will remember a lot of memory. Whereas for if you know the underlying principle, the model, which is, let's say, Newton's law, just 2 lines. The complexity is much less. Simple model. But you can apply that on your future examples. But the Newton's law is not an exact law. Memorize on the training set, the memorization gives much less error. Newton's law, any law is after all an approximate law. It gives maybe minor nanometer error or some error it will give. But you ignore that error. You use this law. You need less memory. You will better understand in future examples. You will generalize well. Okay, so there is both way, either in terms of model complexity or the number of training epochs. Each iteration, by the way, this backpropagation is done over iteration. Several times you do this. That's why the training computational complexity comes in. You should stop your training after so many epochs. If you increase your training, this curve is also visible. You should stop here. Similarly, model complexity stop here. So to answer your question that what is the right number of nodes you should have, nobody has an answer right now. The best you can do is to look at these curves, and whenever you observe this phenomena, to stop there, to choose those many neurons. That's the answer. Nothing better than that. Okay. There is another concept known as regularization. It's like somebody is telling you, somebody is, when in your learning process, moment you go into rote learning, there is some teacher or somebody, there is some error function which reminds you that you are rote learning. It penalizes. For example, it penalizes a large value of the weights. In the error function itself, it adds additional actual output, which is proportional to, let's say, the magnitude of the weight terms. It penalizes. So your error is not just error you make on the training set, plus how much rote learning, how much complexity you are using. Are you using a heavy model? You penalize. Don't use a heavy model. Don't use a large model. You should be. It's okay to sacrifice a little bit of training set accuracy if you can achieve that using a simple model. This actually, there is a principle in machine learning called the Occam's razor principle. So Occam was a barber in Britain in around, I think, 1500. So what he said is that if you are building a saving blade or something, a razor you are building, you should build a razor which is not too complicated. You should build a razor which is just complicated enough to do the job it is meant to do. If you build anything more complicated than that, maybe with a fancy handle or something, it will fail in some situation. So make your model only as complex as it is necessary, not further. That's the Occam design principle. That's what is diagrammatically shown here. Okay, so as I said, the number of topology, the architecture, number of neurons you need in each layer, there is no theoretical answer to that. You have to do this kind of experiments and decide. By the way, the number of nodes are sometimes also called hyperparameters, and you have to kind of search. You have to do a trial and error over multiple hyperparameters to find out the right one. That's the best we can do now. There's no theory. There's a lot of theoretical research going on into that, but we don't know. Okay, so there is another kind of thing. If you look at the test accuracy, that is the generalization performance, you see that if you look at the number of parameters in this range for a I soon tell. You look at this grain curve. So, or you look at this curve. So the question is, as you change the model complexity, this curve inflects somewhere and something. So naturally, you will. So if you measure complexity by, let's say, because you see the number of these connections are much more than the number of nodes. They are much more than the number of nodes. So you usually specify complexity at the number of connections you have. So the x-axis here is number of connections. So maybe if you have another way of topology, say not just feed forward, something else, if some other way you connect it, if you can have this blue curve, which kind of the lowest point happens in less complicated model with less complexity. Maybe let's see if I can go on. Maybe if I have a model something like this one, yeah, if I have a model something like this will be better because I can realize the lowest point with less number of connections. What is the advantage of less number of connections? You have a smaller network, you train it faster. Okay. You train it faster. So, can I change this basic connection principle so that this happens? So, people suggested one new architecture which is deeper but has some constraint on the way you connect it. So, use more neurons, use more layers, but the number of connections is not that large. Is a fully connected layer. Because see, the large number of connections is happening because you are fully connecting them. You avoid that. So if you are avoiding fully connect, how do you use? You use the principle, you mimic the principle in which an mammalian brain or an advanced organism's brain processes. Okay. So this right side is a biological understanding of how we process information, say how we process images, how we process sound, and this is kind of a mimicking of that, copy of that. They say that there is a division of labor among the neurons. Some neurons do some function, other neurons do other function. What are the functions? Let's say I have a sensory input. Let's say I will look at our eye. And then there are some low-level neurons directly connected to our eye, which do not take a decision that this is Virat Kohli's face or Mahendra Singh Dhoni's face. It rather takes a decision: does this face contains vertical line or it contains a sharp nose? Does it contain a round eyes? Does it contain a short hairs? Does it contain a beard? This type of basic level information it takes into account. These are called low level operations. These are sometimes also called feature extractors. This will just look at a face. It will not decide it is Mahendra Singh Dhoni or not Virendra Sehwag or Virat Kohli. It will decide whether this face has a sharp nose, whether this face has short hair, whether this face has, and this can be in layers. Maybe the lowest layer of this can decide how many vertical lines are there in the face image, how many horizontal lines are there, and maybe the next level will decide how big is the nose. Maybe the next level will decide what is the relative position of the nose and the eyes. And then once all these features are ready, the higher level brain will process these features and take the decision whether it is Virat Kohli or Mahendra Singh Dhoni. It will take this decision. So you have a layered kind of, or not, I should say layered, you have a stack-like architecture. Okay. Because these functions are different, what is done in higher level is different from that what is done in lower level, you can have a different architecture for each of these. So this is again another fundamental difference between neural network and, so in a neural network, all the neurons are kind of equivalent, they do the same function. But now I can sort of have building blocks. Any of you have used the Lego, the building blocks? You use some bricks and you make a building, you add them up one after the other. So what you do, you have specialized. There is a wheel and there is a rectangular block and so on. So what you do, you kind of combine these kind of blocks. There are some vertical feature extractors. You take some vertical feature lines. You take some circle extractor. You take some triangle extractor. You take them. You have specified smaller networks for them, and then you put them together. You put them together just like a Lego block, and you create a complete architecture. This gives you a lots of freedom. You can connect up in any way. You can connect up feed-forward networks with feedback network. By the way, there is another category called the recurrent network and feed-forward network, which has a backward connection also. You connect them up. You have a specialized kind of layers for doing only feature extraction. Okay, this opens up a lot of things. You can have many complicated deep architectures by combining these basic architectures. You have much more freedom to build your system, and it's very exciting. So that is what is meant. Okay, so let us look at one particular architecture which is useful in extracting these features. Then what we'll do, we'll extract these features and connect up with a multi-layer, fully connected multi-layer perceptor, and have an architecture called a convolutional neural network architecture. So these are the motivations. This kind of, if you break up into do a division of labor, it gives you more freedom. It helps you handle more data. Secondly, this makes them more amenable to GPU accelerations. Okay, so this is what I said. There is a hierarchical organization. So this, in the input, this is a visual stimulus. You can consider this as an image. Consider this as an image. Okay, you can consider this as an image. And then in the input layer of the neural network, you have something called a receptive field. What this receptive field does, it looks at different parts of the image. And if some type of feature, maybe this is a feature we are looking at, some sub-image, this kind of structure in the image or this kind of patch in the image we are looking at. If that patch is present, this would say, yes, that patch is present in the image, in this region. So these receptive fields just identify this kind of substructures in the image. Okay, so let me see. Okay, so this particular scheme was very popular in image recognition tasks, which is one of the first instance of deep learning. There was a challenge called the ImageNet challenge. You have to recognize categories of images from a very large set, and then you have to do this. So what they do, they connected up all this. I'll quickly me explain this, what this means. So as I have said, at the input they have a convolutional layer, which is this receptive field. What this does, it's kind of this kind of small block of the image it takes. Let's say it looks at only this block. So one neuron looks at, or one receptive subfield, one part of the convolutional layer looks at this, and it trains something called a filter. So depending on the weight values, you set the weight values in. I'll explain what convolution means. Okay, let me explain this. I'll soon go into that. So it finds out whether this kind of oblique line is there, this structure, this coming down, going up, it is there. If that is there, it forms an image map, a filtered map. Then it does, so this group of layers should be called a convolution layer. Then it does a subsampling. Subsampling means that after this convolution, okay, let me explain what is convolution. It's like a filter. You have an image, let's say 256 by 256 image. You have a small window, let's say 3 by 3 window. 3 by 3 window. So you scan the entire image. This window is like a torch, you can say. You scan the window by moving this, scan the image by moving this window over the entire image. And when you are, and what this window does, it's like a filter. What it does, let's say a 2 by 2 window, 2 by 2 window. So this 2 by 2 window, let's say it has a value 1001. So I have 4 pixels, 1001. So what it looks at, when you place this window over 4 pixels of an image, it will take the 11 pixel and the 22 pixel, because it is 1001. It will take those 2 pixels, add them up, and the result it will put out. Why it is called a filter? Let's look at this. Okay, so let's say if the filter is like this, if there it is 1 here, and 0 everywhere else. 1 in this black part, 0 everywhere. That's what the filter looks like. Okay, so this filter will give an output of non-zero output when the image has something like this. But this filter, if you put say somewhere here, its output will be 0. This filter, if you place somewhere here on the image, it will match those, it will see the output to be 0. Like if you place the filter here, its output will be 1. So this filter actually detects parts of the image where you have this structure. Maybe if you place the filter here, again you will get a 1, because that structure is somewhat there. Okay, so this filter detects this sub-architecture. Now, this filter, how do I know how do I set this filter values? How do I should say that this is the thing I should look for? In a convolution layer, what type of structure it will look into is determined by the weights, the connection weights that we talked about earlier. Okay, so these weights, this is taken from a course by Jan LeCun, taught in 1998. I think again, no, this paper is from 1990. This is a 2017 lecture in this course by Jan LeCun. So what is this weight should determine? So I said 1001. It can as well be W11, W01, W10, W22. Sorry, W11, W00. So these weight values are learned by the backpropagator, so that you get the filter in certain way, so that the final output is the correct output. This is learned. The filter weights are learned. That's what a convolution is learned. And then you run this filter over the entire image. You get another image which is same size as this image, but with values 0s and 1. So it's like a mask image. So if you run this filter, let's say over the entire image, it will have 1 here and 1 here, black everywhere else, or not black, maybe 0 everywhere else. That kind of picture, that filtered image will come. Now what you do a subsampling. This is the original size as this image. You do a subsampling. That means you take a small block, and let's say if it is a 256 block, I want to subsample it to, let's say, 64 by 64. So what I will take 4 by 4 block in the green image. I take the average value or max value or mean value, depending on mean pooling or max pooling or average pooling, and that value I'll put as a single pixel in this smaller image. So 4 by 4 pixel is replaced by a single pixel. The value of the single pixel is either the average of this 4 by 4 pixels or the maximum of this 4 by 4 pixels, and so on. So this is called a pooling, and you have a subsample layer. So this convolution and pooling, they are put in combination, and often they are done several times. So you do convolution, then pooling, then again convolution, then pooling, and so on. Finally, after the final pooling, you get a set of such small images, and they are called features. And these features, these values, are used as input to a standard multi-layer perceptron. We call here as a fully connected layer as earlier, that we discussed so far. Same fully connected network, whose input. So I do a feature extraction with all this convolution, pooling, convolution, pooling, convolution, pooling. I get a set of features. These are these final features that I have talked about. These final features that we talked about. Those features go to this fully connected layer. Fully connected layer takes the decision, and then you get out the class level. Okay, so this is the architecture. So let me quickly go to, I don't have much time. I'll share the slides actually, you can go to. So this is a demonstration. So this is the input image. This is a convolution layer, convolution. By the way, sometimes the input image is a RGB image. It's not one image, but 3 images actually. So your convolution is over this 224 by 3, this small block. I'm sorry, it's not 224, it's smaller. Let's say 5 by 5 by 3 is a small block. This is one. Also, one node in this convolution layer takes this receptive field, this subimage. Okay, so this is a typical deep architecture where you have 2 convolution, then one max pooling, subsampling, again 2 convolution, smaller, again 2 convolution, then a max pooling, again 2 convolution, then a max pooling, finally the fully connected. And then you have something called softmax, because softmax is something like this. In this output, you have several output which decides. Yes, we'll definitely share the slides. You look at the GitHub page, we'll share the slides. So your output is some values. What softmax takes, it takes e to the power those values and normalizes them so that they add up to 1, and takes the highest value. So suppose I have 2 output, one is for Mahendra Singh Dhoni, and one is for Virat Kohli. Let's say the value of one is 0.9 and another is 0.1. So you normalize, another is let's say 0.4. You normalize so that they add up to 1 by this softmax and take the highest, take the max. That would give you the, say Mahendra Singh Dhoni is the highest in it class, would I'll predict as Mahendra Singh Dhoni. Okay. So this is the convolution, and then so what it basically does is, I think I've already explained. It takes a set of, so these connections, you look at these connections, these lines that I'm drawing, these are the kind. They have some weights, W1, W1, 2, and so on. And these are the pixel values. There are 3 pixel values, red, green, and blue. I multiply them by their weight, and I get a value here. Okay. Similarly, I shift this block by 1 pixel or 2 pixel, let's say 1 pixel. I get another block at the side of this, and then apply the same filter. I don't change the W values. The weight values are constant for that filter. I apply the same W values. I do the convolution, get another value. So I try to imagine if I keep on shifting 1 pixel, 1 pixel, 1 pixel, then 1 pixel, I will get another image. Hello, volume is gone. Okay, I'll check. I think my audio is gone.
No, Professor Pabitra, we can hear you pretty
well. You can hear?
Yeah, I can hear
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so you shift this and you apply this convolution, you get another pixel value. So this would be another image, which is a filtered version of this image that we get by applying this W1 W naught, those operators. Okay. So this is the same size as this. So then what you do, you apply a pooling where you do a downsampling basically. So this is my, let's say, filter image 224 by 224. I take a small block, let's say 2 by 2 block. Whatever is the maximum value in the 2 by 2 block, that corresponding pixel, I put that value. So I get 4 pixels get replaced by 1 pixel. So naturally, if this is a 224 by 224, I'd get a 112 by 112 image here. This one, you mean convolution, how does it get 128? Okay, am I wrong here? I'll answer. Wait, just let me complete this. Okay, so this is a pooling layer. This is what I have said. So you look at this block 1156, the max is 6. So this 4 pixels should be replaced by 6 in this subsampling. All right, so you see, so finally, see what this convolution 64 means is that you have 64 filters. Okay, 64 defined filters. Making some mistake here. Anyway, let's assume that. I'll check this whether this is right or not. Okay, so if you do this convolution pooling after sufficient number of times, you finally end up with, say, so how many pixels you have and how many filters you have. You end up with so many. Note that, okay, so what do you mean by this convolution 64 is that, see, this is this 224 is the input image size. This can change. What convolution 64 means that I have 64 such neurons. And each neuron has a fixed set of weight, W1, W12, and so on. So each of this neuron, is a filter like this. If I apply that on such small blocks, say 4 by 4 blocks or something, across this, everywhere, I will get one slice of these 64 slices. One slice of these 64 slices. Then if I take another neuron, I'll get another slice of these 64 slices. So all these 64 different value, maybe the first slice is looking at this feature. Maybe the second slice is looking at this feature, vertical feature. Third slice is looking at this horizontal feature. This way, 64 different features, substructures I am looking at. 128 means 128 different substructures. The reason I am increasing this number of slices or number of neurons, number of filters, is that as I go down this layer, I get more and more complicated filtered images. And more complicated filtered images I have, more and more different combination of features I can have. Because if it is vertical, I can have only one vertical or only one type of vertical. If it is a more complicated feature, I can have different types of that. So I am increasing the number of filters. Because more complicated the image is, as you go down the layers, more different type of features I can have. And more number of filters I'd like to have. Okay, so this is max pooling. So let's say finally I have a 7 by 7. After all this downscaling pooling, I have a 7 by 7 feature map, and I have 512 such layers, 512 such slices, 512 such filters. So if we multiply this 7 into 7 into 512, I will have 1 into 1 into 496 different values. I flatten them up and I keep this as input to the next layer. Okay. So this entire thing, if you look at if you take any error function, say cross entropy or mean square error, sum square error, all of them are differentiable. The API for each pooling and convolution are same. They have the same structure, and you can easily call them. And this is a kind of visualization of the intermediate layer features. More and more complicated features you see. These are kind of only lines and colors. And here there are combination of colors. Here there are sort of pure colors and pure vertical, tilted lines. Here you see more complicated features, combination of colors, combination of lines, and here you see really complicated local structures coming up. Local structure, and maybe finally when we realize, decide which class this image belongs to, maybe these features are what we use in the fully connected layer. Okay. These are some of the things. And finally, as we have said, in the output we will get something like this, some values. You will apply a softmax, see which is the max. This is the max, and I say this is the minimum. Okay, so this is the training rule. This is same as the multi-layer perceptron. There are many modifications to this. One of this is called a residual net or res net, where you don't have connections from ith layer to I plus 1th layer, but you have skip connections also, or shortcut connections also. Okay, and this residual between this and this shortcut is added up. You have a ReLU, rectified linear unit, which is an activation function. So by the way, one problem these deep layers have while training is something called a vanishing gradient, because you are calculating the sigma squashes everything to a saturation value, and if you do this several times, the gradient becomes zero, it vanishes. And if gradient becomes zero, there is no perceptible change in weight values. So this is the problem with the S-shaped function sigmoid. This is rectified by something called a rectified linear unit, where you have a, so sigmoid is like this. Instead, we have an activation function which is like this. So here, see, the derivative here is zero. Derivative here is zero. Here the derivative here is zero, but here the derivative is not zero anymore. So gradient does not vanish. Okay, so this is kind of the here get the answer why 0.3 is selected. Okay, yeah, maybe I made a mistake there. A dog, this way. Okay, this should have been the highest value. I made a mistake. Actually, I'm not sure, but anyway, the highest would remain the highest. If you do a softmax, so see, they don't add up to 1. Do they add up to 1? They add up. Yeah, I think they add up to 1. Okay, so this is kind of normalized using the softmax e to the power something rule, so that all these values add up to 1. Okay, so and then you should, after you do this normalization, you should pick up the highest value. So maybe there's a typo here. This should have been a dog, or maybe this should have been 0.3. This should have been 0.4. There's another. So you allow these skip connections, and you have a residual net. I'm just showing you this picture. So this is kind of again motivated by something called a pyramidal cells that are present in the mammalian cortex in the central nervous system. So the same structure is there as a convolution. It's basically a convolution network, but with some shortcut connections. Why we call it residual? Because there is some value which is explained directly from this. So basically here in this, you not only use these features, you use some of these previous features also, previous layer features also. Okay, so this is a kind of fully architecture. So by the way, there are many variations of this this structure. Yeah, this structure. You can have, there is a AlexNet which have 100 such convolutions subsampling. So basically this structure. This can be 100 deep. There is a Google net, there is a LayNet, there is a AlexNet. There are many versions depending on how you combine them, how many layers you have, and so on. Quickly, this is another architecture called a DenseNet, where you not only have a shortcut connection from I-1 to I+1th layer, you have a shortcut connection from I-1 to I+1, I+2, I+3, and so on, everywhere. Similarly, from here to everywhere forward. So this is a densely connected network. You have more number of connections. This is a dense net. This is again a convolution network with slightly more number of connections. These are the problems that we talked about. Accelerating training, vanishing gradient, overfitting, hyperparameter tuning, extremely challenge. How many layers, how many dropout parameters. So dropout is like what you do in the process of training is sometimes some neurons If you find they are not contributing much to the output, you remove them from your, you delete them from your, that's a dropout. Okay, this is a comparison of the computational complexity. There are many variations, inception rate, PGG rate. So this is the operations, and this is the accuracy. Okay, so what you'd like to have is less number of operations but more accuracy. This is a plot of this. All right, so this is kind of all I have. I have not touched upon other architectures like sequential, like recurrent neural network, LSTM for sequence learning, stack autoencoders just for representation learning, GAN, generative adversarial network. I'm also not talking about combining these architectures. For example, there is a nice image annotation tool by combining CNN with LSTM. And the good thing is that it gives you full freedom to combine any of these and within this. The unified backpropagation works out differentiable and very nice. That gives you the power and the freedom. So with this, I end. Most of my talks are taken from the Stanford Deep Learning course and this book, Introduction to Deep Learning by Ian Goodfellow. With this, I stop here. If any question, I have overshot my time. If any question is there, I'll be happy to answer. Let me quickly see if some questions are there. Yeah, let me quickly check. I'll just quickly, in fact, you can mail me also the questions later. I'll put my email address. You can mail me the questions also later. At least the initial layer weights you can reduce, if not the final layer. How to determine the number of training units? It's again. Okay, besides gradient descent, any other optimization? Yes, not in neural network. Other places like quadratic programming and other things are used, but in neural network, mainly gradient descent is used. Yeah, I made a mistake there. 0.4 was next. Like gradient descent, what other machine learning? Yeah, what type of neural network is used in signals? There is something called a one-dimensional convolution, 1D CNN, which is very popular for network. You search up 1D CNN, that's very popular. That is used. There are other things like in fact, LSTM can also be. If you are a sequence, it's like a time series, then LSTM, RNN, these are also very good. How do you increase model accuracy? Yes, that's a big question. Again, there is no answer. That's one of the main drawback of deep learning. It's very powerful, but nobody knows because of its power. See, it's a very powerful system. So if you are using such a powerful system, you have to be careful how to use it. So, and because it's so complicated, you really don't know that this combination of hyperparameters, this many neurons, this many connections, this many convolution layers, or this is the dropout rate. What value gives you the best result for a given data set is still an open problem. Nobody really knows the answer. You have to do trial and error. You have to do hyperparameter searching. How to final question, how to deal with local minima? Well, there are a number of ways. As I said, you modify your gradient descent rule. You apply momentum terms and other terms. The idea is like this. This local minima is like a small local dip. So if you are just looking at steeper descent, you will get stuck there. But what the momentum comes there, you are coming down from somewhere. You take your next step, not only depending on the gradient around you, but around with the momentum you already have. If you have a high momentum, if you are coming down from a very high place, you will go over it, you will jump over it and move maybe. And if you come out of a local minima, you have a good chance of moving forward in future to a global network. A quick expansion on LSTM. Maybe I will quickly say, see, all these are feed-forward network. What is done in recurrent neural network is that there is a feedback link. From the ith layer, there is a connection to I-1th layer. So this helps you, again, if you, this is the digital logic analogy, it's like a sequential memory circuit, flip-flops and others. You have a memory. You know what was there in the previous step, and previous to previous step, and previous to previous step also. Okay, so your output will not only depend, let's say I'm taking a speech signal. My output will not only depend on the value of the speech magnitude at current point, but also at all previous time, because the word depends on utterances in a sequence, previous values also, not just current value. So those memory is required, those memory is there. This is a recurrent network. But the problem in recurrent network is, if you look at the full memory from the beginning of your utterance of speech, it will not give you good value. So what LSTM does, it uses some gates, which is, it not only memorizes, it not only uses first value, it also sometimes forgets first value. You have a forget gate also. And you have a propagation gate. What from past is propagated to future, what is used currently, and what from past is forgotten. You have to forget sometimes also. If you use everything from the past, it will not make sense. So you in your this kind of feedback network, if you add these gates, forget gates and other, you get a long short-term memory. Long short-term memory means some short-term memory you keep, most of the short-term memory you keep, some long-term back memory also you keep. How much proportion of short-term memory you keep, how much proportion of long-term memory you keep, you learn from the data by updating the data. So that's what is in nutshell. Again, I mean, I apologize, I give such a crude definition. There's a nice mathematical definition also. So that's in a nutshell. So I have not talked about these recurrent architectures, but they are also very important. Okay, so I think with this, let me stop here. It's already 11:15.